The manifest arrived on a Tuesday. I remember that detail, because Tuesdays had been, until that point, unremarkable days in my retirement. I woke early out of long habit, made the same coffee I had been making for 41 years of service, and sat in the same chair by the same window that looked out over the Corvold Bay. It was a large bay, the Corvold, wide and quiet, and very blue, in the early morning before the wind came up off the open water. I had chosen this planet specifically because it had no military installation within 400 kilometers. The nearest thing to an admiralty presence was a patrol boat that made a once-weekly pass through the commercial lane north of the bay, and it was the sort of patrol boat that carries 2 crew, and no armament worth discussing. I had spent 41 years in rooms where decisions moved fleets and changed the shape of space, and I had wanted, in retirement, to be somewhere that none of that reached me. I had been wrong about a great many things. I am generally willing to admit that. This was one of them. The message came through my personal routing code. This code is a thing that senior officers accumulate over careers. A private communications address that sits outside the standard military routing architecture, used for matters that require more discretion than the formal channels provide. In 14 months of retirement, it had received exactly 3 communications. A pension adjustment notice, a commemorative message from a signals unit I had commanded 14 years prior on the occasion of their decommissioning, and a short note from an old colleague who had heard I was living near the Corveld and wanted to know if the fishing was worth the transit. I had replied only to the last of those. The 4th communication arrived on a Tuesday. Hurt. The header identified the sender as a routing address I recognized as belonging to the Military Intelligence Division of the Commission on Alien Offense, a body that most career officers know exists and few career officers ever deal with directly, because its mandate is narrow enough that it rarely requires contact with the active fleet. The Commission on Alien Offense is the body that handles exactly what its name describes, not alien diplomatic failures, not contested treaty interpretations, not the ordinary friction of dealing with civilizations that have different definitions of acceptable behavior in shared transit corridors. The Commission exists for the cases beyond that, the cases where the Commission on Foreign Relations has no adequate instrument because the situation has moved past the range of foreign relations. I read the header twice. Then I opened the decryption key, which required a biometric authentication I had not used in 14 months and was slightly surprised still worked, and I began to read. The file was labeled Exhibit 1 in the ongoing case review of the Covenant transport vessel, Southern Kell, seized in the Outer Transit Corridor 11 months prior during a routine interdiction authority sweep. The Southern Kell had been flagged initially as a suspected narcotic substance carrier. It had been running with a modified hull that suggested concealed internal volume, which is one of the profiles the interdiction authority uses to flag vessels for secondary inspection. Crew: 4 Varrock nationals, 1 registered commercial pilot of indeterminate affiliation, 2 cargo handlers, had been detained. The vessel had been impounded. The cargo had been cataloged. I want to be precise about what the cataloging found, because precision is what the dead are owed, and because I am going to say this once, clearly, before I describe anything else. The cargo was not narcotics. What the interdiction authority found in the modified internal volume of the Southern Kell, after 11 months of careful analysis and translation and cross-referencing, was a records archive, physical records on Vorak data medium, a crystalline substrate that their administrative apparatus uses for long-term storage of documents they consider particularly important. The records archive had been stored in a temperature-regulated container built into the modified hull section, surrounded by a false internal bulkhead that was designed to survive a standard secondary inspection, unless the inspecting team probed the hull thickness against the vessel's registered specifications. The interdiction authority team that seized the Southern Kell had been thorough enough to do probing, which is not a routine step, and which is the reason I am able to write any of what follows. The archive was the cargo manifest of the Vorak designation program. It covered 34 years of operational activity. The Vorak word that military intelligence had translated as designation program was rendered in their administrative language as something between selected acquisition and graded procurement, in the same way that a commercial livestock operation uses language designed to describe a process other than its subjects. It was a supply chain document in its architecture. Records of inputs, transit routes, grading outcomes, reserve placement results, and administrative notations describing the status of each acquisition from initial procurement through final disposition. The inputs were human beings, 3,114 of them. Civilian adults, ranging from 19 years old to 61, taken from fringe colonies in the outer transit corridors. 12 separate colony settlements distributed across a transit band that Earth governance had never prioritized for dense patrol coverage. The transit band sat at the edge of 3 overlapping treaty jurisdictions, and each of the 3 parties had arranged its monitoring posture on the assumption that the others were providing adequate coverage of the shared territory. The coverage, in practice, was thin. The Vorak Conclave's procurement apparatus had identified this thinness over a period of time that I calculated, reading the manifest's early entries, had been at least 3 years before the program's first documented acquisition. They had surveyed the zone. They had assessed the patrol patterns. They had selected a set of acquisition points that were individually low, visibility, and collectively distributed enough to prevent any pattern from becoming legible to the monitoring parties. They had been, we'll say plainly, thorough. Each human being in the manifest was assigned a designation code, a 6-character alphanumeric, upon intake into the program. The code served as the individual's identifier across all subsequent documentation, transit records, grading assessments, placement scheduling, reserve management records. Alongside each designation code was a grading assessment in Vorak, describing what the program called Quarry value. The grading rubric ran to 8 categories. I will describe 4 of them: physical conditioning, estimated endurance capacity, environmental adaptation markers, and demonstrated response under duress. I will not describe the other 4 because the translation work that military intelligence produced in the deposition supporting this document renders those 4 categories in language that I am not willing to repeat in a signed record. And the deposition is available to anyone who needs to read it, and they can read it themselves. Quarry value. That is what the Vorak Conclave called the 3,114 human beings it had been quietly removing from the fringe corridors over 34 years. It had looked at our people, assessed them against an 8-category rubric, assigned each a numerical grade, and then transported them to a planet the Conclave designated in their own administrative language as the Long Ground, Vorak Kos, which was a managed reserve world that the Conclave had been developing for decades as the Sifilmakor classifies high expression of hereditary distinction, the ritual hunt, the practice by which the Vorak nobility's social hierarchy was organized, maintained, and renewed. The thing that made the estate world holdings and the political architecture and the elaborate apparatus of a centuries-old aristocracy feel, to the people at the top of it, like they had been earned. They had hunted our people for sport for 34 years. I know what I did next because I remember it with unusual clarity, the kind of clarity that attaches to moments you know, while they are happening, will not leave you. I read the first 40 pages of the manifest, enough to understand the architecture of the program, the grading rubric, transit route documentation, the reserve placement records. I verified the authentication markers. I checked the chain of custody stamps against the interdiction authority's seizure documentation. I cross-referenced military intelligence's translation against the original Vorak substrate rendering, a process that required me to use an interface I had not opened in 14 months. Because I have working competence in formal Vorak administrative language from a posting early in my career, because I was not prepared to accept that this document said what it said without checking the translation myself. It said what it said. I sat for some time at the window over the Corvold Bay. The sun had moved across the water while I was reading. The bay was no longer early morning blue. It had shifted to the bright, mid-morning green it takes on when the wind comes up and the surface catches the light at a different angle. I watched it for a while. Then I placed the call to the Admiralty. I want to describe how I placed that call. I think the description is part of the record. I did not call the Foreign Relations desk, which would have been the first reflex of any career officer looking at documentation suggesting a diplomatic incident. I called the Commission on Alien Offense directly. At the routing address the message had come from is itself an escalation. Routing to the Commission directly rather than through the diplomatic channel says something about how the caller has assessed the situation. I was aware of this when I made the decision. I made it anyway. The Commission's watch officer answered. I identified myself and said that I had authenticated the document they had sent and that I wanted to speak with the Commission chair. The watch officer asked the nature of my call. I said the nature was that what I had just read required a conversation at the senior level. The watch officer put me through. The Commission chair was a woman I had met twice in my career. We had not been close. She remembered me, and she listened without interrupting. And when I had described the manifest's contents in the terms I had just described them to you, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Is there any interpretive ambiguity in the grading language?" I said, "No," she said, "and the placement records clearly indicate the reserve as the terminus for acquisition." I said, "There is a map, a detailed management map of the reserve's terrain. The placement records reference coordinates on that map. Terrain was modified over several decades for the purpose." Another silence. Then she said, "I'll convene the full commission this afternoon. Present the authentication results." I told her yes. The commission convened that afternoon and I presented the authentication results. The commission saw what the manifest said. The commission issued, by that evening, an internal classification order that sealed all knowledge of the manifest and the Southern Kells cargo from the regular diplomatic apparatus. This meant the Vorak Conclave's embassy on the transit station would receive no notification, no inquiry, no routine request for explanation, no hint that the Southern Kells archive had been discovered and read. The classification order also meant that the interdiction authority's case, review of the seized vessel, would be reclassified from a contraband assessment, proceeding to something with a different administrative designation, one that the Admiralty used for cases that were going to move through a different kind of process. All of this happened in a single day. On the following morning, 47 hours after I had placed the call to the commission, the secretary contacted me and asked whether I would be willing to accept an assignment. The assignment was to serve as civilian witness designate aboard the command ship of the assembled response fleet. I said yes. I want to be precise about what I understood the assignment to be when I said yes. A witness designate is not a tactical role. A witness designate does not command, does not advise, does not participate in operational decision-making. A witness designate observes. A witness designate carries the weight of what they have seen into the permanent record, the commission's record, the historical record, the kind of record that exists, so that there is no argument afterward about what was done and why and by whom and in response to what. The Admiralty wanted someone who had read the manifest with fresh eyes, before the institutional machinery processed it, to stand in the room where the response was delivered so that the connection between the specific act recorded in those 163 pages and the specific answer the resolved claim was going to give was present in the room, embodied in a person who could sign a name to it afterward. That is what I understood. I packed 2 bags, contacted my sister on Corvold Station, and told her I had accepted a short assignment of unspecified duration. She knew better than to ask for detail. She had known me for 41 years of service. I took the shuttle to the Admiralty's staging facility at Kessler Transit, a 16-hour journey, and during that journey I began doing something I had started the night of the manifest and could not stop. I read names. The manifest assigned every acquisition a designation code. The codes were the program's working identifiers. Everything in the administrative texture of the designation program used the 6-character alphanumerics. Because the codes were operationally useful, and because using codes instead of names was, among other things, a technique for managing how the people inside the program thought about its subjects. A code describes a unit of managed resource. A name describes a person. The Vorak Conclave had made a choice about which description it wanted to use, and that choice was encoded into 34 years of record-keeping. I was going to reverse it. Had begun extracting names from the manifest using the partial biographical data the Commission had assembled from Earth Governance's various registry systems, colony registration records, commercial transit filings, medical archives, employment records, the records that fringe colony populations leave behind them. In the ordinary course of lives lived in difficult places. See, the Commission's research staff had worked for 11 months on the extraction, starting the day the archive was identified, and had managed to recover full names for approximately 28% of the manifest's entries. For the remaining 72%, the records were either unavailable, taken from places that didn't maintain the relevant registries, or damaged, or so incomplete that the name could not be confirmed. The Commission's staff had hit the limit of what institutional research could accomplish. I did not have that limit. I had the complete manifest, a translation interface, 41 years of training in Vorak administrative language, and the time that retirement provides. I was going to read every designation code and extract every name that could be extracted, and for the ones where the fringe registry records were insufficient, I was going to find other pathways. In-person reports filed in the transit-banned jurisdictions, commercial manifests that recorded passengers in transit corridors before they disappeared, station log entries that documented individuals and their planned routes. The fringe corridors were thin with official records, but not empty of them. And the people who had lived there had left traces in them, and I was going to find those traces. I understood that this was a project that would take years. I began it on the shuttle to Kessler Transit. The first name I extracted that night was a woman named Para Delion. She had been taken from a commercial transport vessel, the Marin Corridor, 31 years earlier at the age of 31. She had been traveling on a registered commercial transit route between two fringe colony stations. The Marin Corridor's passenger manifest, recovered from the transit station archive at one end of the route, listed her as a passenger who had boarded but whose disembarkation had never been logged at the destination station. This record had been filed, at the time, as a transit discrepancy, the category used when passenger records don't resolve cleanly across the transit corridor's administrative handoff points. Transit discrepancies in the fringe corridors were common enough that the notation had not prompted additional investigation. She had been assigned designation code 3K21A4 and a Quarry value grade of 4.7 on the Vorak rubric, reflecting in the grading criteria, physical conditioning, and adequate spatial reasoning. She had been placed on Vorak Kas, the long ground, in the manifest year 3. There was no further entry for Para Delion after placement. The manifest did not record outcomes for individual designations released onto the reserve. It recorded only that they had been placed, because after placement they were no longer a supply chain concern. They were the hunt. I read her name aloud in the empty shuttle cabin, quietly enough that the words were for me and the record I was keeping in my own mind, and then I moved to the next entry. The resolved claim assembled over 11 months. This was deliberate. And I want to address the characterization that has sometimes been applied to that 11-month period, because the characterization is wrong, and I am a witness to the truth of it. There were people during the diplomatic turbulence that followed the operation, and there have been people in the years since, who have described the 11-month assembly as hesitance, as the Admiralty pausing to reconsider the scope of the response, as an opportunity left open for the Vorak Conclave to offer some form of accounting that might have altered what happened. The 11 months were what it took to assemble 395 warships at a staging position without alerting the Vorak Conclave's intelligence apparatus. Conclave maintained surveillance capability across the treaty-adjacent zones around their space. It was not highly sophisticated by Earth's standards, but it was adequate to detect large fleet movements if those movements were conducted without care. The Commission had determined, very early in the process, that the response would not be announced. There would be no ultimatum delivered in advance, no diplomatic notification, no formal presentation of the manifest to the conclave's embassy, followed by a demand for accounting. The reasons for this decision are not complicated. The commission had read the manifest. The manifest showed a program that had been operating for 34 years, with elaborate care taken to ensure its low visibility. A civilization that had maintained that architecture of concealment for 34 years would, if given advance notice of the response, use the advance notice to prepare additional concealment, to move records, to relocate personnel, to construct deniability, for the infrastructure that had made the program possible. The Commission was not interested in what the Vorok Conclave would do with advance notice. It was interested in the record that already existed, in the 163 pages of the manifest, and in the response that record required. 11 months of careful, distributed staging. Ships arriving at Kessler Transit in groups small enough to appear consistent with routine fleet maintenance rotations. Then, entering through 3 additional, forward staging points under commercial cover and decommissioning transit protocols. The Admiralty had enough experience with large-scale fleet movements that it understood how to make a 395-ship response fleet look to a distant surveillance apparatus like nothing in particular. It was painstaking work, and it was done with the same precision that characterized everything else about the resolved claims preparation. I arrived at the primary staging facility 6 months into the assembly, completing the 16-hour journey from Corveld, and then a secondary transit from Kessler to the forward staging position. ECS Declarant was already in position. She had been the first capital ship placed, 14 months before the response, and her presence at the staging facility had been maintained under a decommissioning assessment protocol that provided legitimate cover for extended static positioning. She was a heavy command ship, 340 meters from bow to stern, with the modified bridge architecture that the Admiralty uses for fleet coordination vessels. Extra sensor integration, expanded communications suite, the observation station on the command deck that gives witness designates and embedded personnel a direct view of the operational theater during active operations. By the time I arrived, approximately 230 ships of the eventual 395 had reached their staging positions through the distributed arrival protocol. I stood at the viewport in my assigned quarters on the first evening and looked at what had been assembled, and I will say something here that I have said in commission testimony, but that deserves to be said in the witness record as well. The fleet was not an expression of rage. I want that clearly understood, because the post-operation discourse sometimes characterized it that way. As Earth's emotional response to a revelation, spasm of institutional fury. It was not that. What I was looking at through the viewport was the product of 11 months of methodical operational planning, careful logistical coordination, precise staging, and the sustained effort of an Admiralty that had read the manifest and made a decision about what accountability required. Each ship in the staging position had been there long enough that its crew had received a full briefing on the manifest's contents and the program it documented. Every commanding officer aboard every vessel in the resolved claim had read the same 163 pages I had read. The choice made by each of them to be here, to execute this assignment with exactness, had been made with full knowledge of what they were doing and why. There is a kind of moral clarity that comes from that. I had felt it in my own decision, saying yes to the Commission's assignment on the morning after the manifest. I recognized it in the fleet, assembled outside my viewport. It was not heat, it was structure. The grief had done its work on all of us, on the Commission, on the Admiralty, on the 395 crews preparing in their staged positions. And what the grief left behind when it organized itself was this: the ships, and the plan, and the precision, and the willingness to see it through exactly as far as the manifest required. I thought about Paradelion, taken from the Marin Corridor 31 years ago at the age of 31, assigned designation code 3K21A4. I thought about the 11 months it had taken to build the response to her taking and to the taking of everyone else in that manifest. And I thought that 11 months was not a long time for what was being assembled, and that the Vorak conclave had 34 years to consider the consequences of the designation program, and that 34 years had not prompted them to alter it in any way the manifest recorded. I turned from the viewport and opened the manifest's alphabetical sequence and read the next name. Admiral Yen Krast met me at the docking ring. I had served under Krast briefly at the very beginning of my career, when she was a senior commander and I was a lieutenant who had not yet understood the difference between knowing how to do a thing and knowing when to do it. That had been more than 30 years ago, and in the intervening time she had become the kind of officer that the Admiralty keeps in mind for exactly this sort of assignment, not because she was the most decorated, though her record was strong, but because the officers who review command appointments for operations of this kind are looking for something specific. They are looking for officers who can carry the full weight of what is being done, without letting the weight become chaos. Krast could do that. I knew it from 30 years ago, and I confirmed it within the first 3 minutes of meeting her again. She met me at the docking ring with a short handshake and shorter words. She led me to the quarters I would occupy, and the observation station I had been assigned on the command deck, and she told me the operational timeline and the current status of fleet assembly. And then she said, "You've read the manifest?" "Yes," I said. All of it, all of it." She nodded once, a small controlled motion. "Good," she said. "So have I." She turned and went back to the bridge. That was the entirety of our personal conversation about the manifest for the next 3 months. I do not intend that as a criticism of Krast. It is rather one of the things that gave me the most confidence in what was assembled around me. She had read every page. She had whatever she needed from that reading. She did not need to discuss it, because discussion was not what the situation required of her. What it required of her was the operation, executed with exactness, and the name I authenticated and the names I was reading in the evenings were safe in her hands precisely because she did not feel the need to perform the weight of them. She simply carried it. The Vorak conclave transmitted 3 diplomatic inquiries during the 11 months of assembly. The first arrived 8 months in. It was addressed to the Earth Governance Foreign Relations Desk in standard diplomatic protocol, and asked, in the kind of polished interstellar standard language that experienced diplomatic apparatus produces, whether Earth governance was aware of several unauthorized interdiction actions taken against Vorak commercial vessels in the outer transit corridors. The phrasing was careful, not an accusation, not quite a protest, calibrated to invite a response that could be shaped into a diplomatic posture, first step in a conversation the conclave apparently expected to be having. The Foreign Relations Desk had been instructed, via the Commission's classification order, to forward all Vorak diplomatic communications to the Commission on Alien Offense without reply or acknowledgement during the assembly period. The inquiry was logged, no reply was transmitted. The second inquiry arrived 3 months later. Its calibration was slightly off from the first, in the way that the calibration of a confident institution shifts when it encounters silence. It did not expect. It asked whether Earth governance had noted a pattern of commercial disruption along the outer transit band and expressed the conclaves for a consultation that could address any misunderstandings arising from the pattern. It was logged. No reply was transmitted. The third inquiry arrived 6 weeks before the resolved claim departed its staging position. It was addressed to the Commission on Alien Offense by name. Someone in the Vorak administrative apparatus had determined, correctly, that the Commission's involvement explained the silence and had decided to address the source directly. It used, for the first time, language suggesting that the conclave was prepared to discuss the matter of the transit interdictions through appropriate channels. I read that phrase in the logged transcript in my quarters aboard ECS Declarant, with my personal display showing the 1203rd entry in the manifest's alphabetical sequence. A woman named Ketsia Orvath, who had been 23 years old when she was taken from a medical relay station in year 19 of the program. I sat with the phrase for a moment. Then I returned to the names. The third inquiry was logged. No reply was transmitted. The resolved claim parted Kessler per Transit's final staging position at 0400 hours on a Wednesday, which I noted and then filed away, because the day of week felt briefly as though it might carry some significance and I could not find any significance in it. 395 warships leaving a coordinated staging position in sequence departure is not invisible even when it is conducted with care, and the Vorok Conclave's surveillance apparatus detected the movement within a few hours of our departure. The signal's intelligence debrief I received afterward confirmed that an internal alert had been transmitted to the Conclave's estate worlds, and to reserve within 4 hours of our departure sequence beginning. They had 9 days to respond to what was coming. They spent those 9 days transmitting diplomatic communications. 4 additional inquiries during the transit period, 2 of them addressed directly to ECS declarant by vessel registration, which meant their intelligence apparatus had identified the command ship. The communications became, over the 9 days, progressively less calibrated, the polished interstellar standard diplomatic language giving way, in the final 2 transmissions, to something more direct, more urgent in register, still formal, but with the seams showing. They still did not know precisely what was coming. They knew 395 Earth warships were in transit toward their space. They could calculate, from the fleeces and the transit vector, approximately where those warships were going. They were transmitting because transmitting is what diplomatic apparatus does when it does not have another tool available. All 4 were logged. No replies transmitted. I spent the 9 days of transit reading names. I had reached entry 1708 by the time we arrived at Vorok, working through the alphabetical sequence in the evenings and documenting each extraction in the record I was building alongside the Commission's primary archive. I had by then also compiled partial biographical data for 491 entries, a significant increase from the 211 the Commission's initial research had recovered, because I had been working through fringe corridor missing person records, filed with 9 different jurisdictional authorities, and cross-referencing them against the manifest's intake dates and acquisition point coordinates. The fringe corridors produced thin records but not empty ones, and in the patterns of transit discrepancy and disappearance, reports filed over 3 decades with stations and colonial registries that had never been asked to look at the pattern as a whole. There were names. I found them. I wrote them down. That work continued through every week of the transit and the operation itself. In the evenings, in the hours between watches when the ship was quiet, and the sensor displays showed the stars moving past at transit speed, each name was its own act of reversal. The designation code becoming a person again, the quarry value grade becoming irrelevant, the administrative notation becoming a human life that had been interrupted and needed to be documented as such. I do not think I can fully convey, to someone who was not present in the weeks leading up to and during the operation, the quality of the silence aboard ECS declarant. It was not the silence of uncertainty. There was no uncertainty about what was happening or what was going to happen. It was the silence of people who understood what was in the manifest and had organized everything they had in response to it. Crew was not angry in the way that word usually implies. The disordered urgency, the heat of it. What they were was resolved. The way a body is resolved when it has already made its decision and is simply executing it, step by step, in exactly the sequence required. I watched the crew of ECS declarant for 9 days, and I thought about how it is that grief works when it is given enough material and enough time. I thought about the 3,114 names in the manifest and the 34 years of the program that had produced those names and the architecture of careful concealment around it. And I thought about what it means to have been doing something for a long time without knowing it is being done to you. And then I thought about 17 days and 395 ships, and I thought that the accounting was about to begin. The resolved claim arrived at Vorok at dawn, local planetary time. The operations seats staff had calculated this deliberately. The operational record states the reason. Arriving at the reserve world in conditions of full daylight ensured clear sensor resolution of the terrain and created an unambiguous visual record of the operational theater for all subsequent review. Nothing about arrival timing was determined by sentiment. Everything was determined by the requirements of an operation that was going to need to withstand every form of subsequent examination and emerge from that examination with nothing left to argue. I was at the observation station on the command deck when we arrived. The planet was amber at the terminator, a warm brown gold that caught the local stars' early light and turned the broad daylight band into something almost beautiful if you looked at it without knowing what it was. The sensor display rendered the planet's surface in fine detail, and, at full sensor magnification, I could see what I had known was there from reading the manifest, but had not quite understood until that moment. The terrain of the long ground was not natural terrain. It had been worked. The Vorak Conclave had spent decades and considerable resource engineering a ground environment suitable for their purpose. I could see, in the sensor display's topographic resolution, the shaped ridgelines, artificial crests built to create defined sightlines across the managed terrain. I could see the approach corridors, wide cleared paths that channeled movement in specific directions. I could see the cover vegetation planted in patterns that I recognized from the reserve management sections of the manifest as deliberate, specific species distributed to provide specific densities of concealment at specific locations, calibrated to the purpose. 3,114 people had been released into that terrain. They had been released with nothing. The manifest's placement records were precise on this point, noting the equipment state of each designation at release as consistent with standard placement protocol, which the manifest's own internal definition translated as unequipped. No tools, no provisions, no knowledge of where they were or what the terrain meant or why they had been brought there. We began the work. The reserve was addressed first. The commission had been explicit about this in the operational planning, and I had been consulted as witness designate about the sequencing, and I had agreed with the commission's reasoning before I'd seen the surface of the planet, and before I understood the full weight of what agreeing meant. Addressing the reserve first was not a strategic calculation in the conventional military sense. It was an accounting decision. Whatever the resolved claim was going to do in the following 17 days, and the operational plan was precise, and had been rehearsed for months. First line of the accounting needed to be the long ground itself, the place that the manifest had designated as the terminus of the program, the place where 2,891 confirmed entries had been placed and never retrieved. I watched from the observation station. I have been asked by members of the commission, by journalists, by the occasional officer from other services who wanted to understand what it had been like, whether there was anything specific I was looking for in the display during the reserve's addressing. I tell them the truth. I was watching to be present. That is the role. A witness designate watches so that the watching is in the record alongside the operational data, so that it can be said afterward that a human being looked at this and did not look away. I watched the sensor displays render the reserve's managed terrain through the fleet's instruments. Watch the operations staff execute the sequence with the efficiency and care they had rehearsed. I watched the amber gold surface of the long ground become something else over the course of the morning, and I held the weight of what I knew about it. The 163 pages, the 34 years, the 3,114 codes that I had been turning back into names, and I did not look away. The Vorak Conclave transmitted a formal protest from their hereditary council on the evening of Day 4. By Day 4, the reserve had been fully addressed, and the resolved claim had moved to the estate worlds. The estate worlds were the living centers of the Conclave's hereditary system, the planetary seats of the noble houses that constituted the Conclave's political architecture. Each estate world housed a noble caste and its associated administrative and service populations. Our operational plan had been precise on this point. The fleet was not administering collective punishment to populations that had been born into a system they had not designed and had not individually chosen to sustain. The targets on the estate worlds were specific. The administrative facilities from which the designation program had been run, the holding and transit facilities through which acquired humans had passed before transfer to the reserve, The Conclave's military command infrastructure that had provided the program with protection and operational cover for 34 years. I want the record to contain that clarity. The resolved claim addressed facilities, not populations. The distinction matters morally, and it was maintained with exactness throughout the 17 days. The protest document was transmitted on day 4, addressed to ECS declarant and simultaneously to 3 other diplomatic routing addresses in Earth Governance's system. Receive the text in my quarters that evening and read it carefully. As I read everything carefully, it was a comprehensive document. The kind that a civilization with centuries of practice in constructing elaborate justifications for its behavior uses when it has sufficient time and motivation. It invoked the Conclave's sovereign designation of Virat Khas under their own territorial law. It characterized the designation program as a regulated cultural practice, with established precedent under Conclave internal governance. It expressed the Conclave's willingness to engage in structured dialogue on the matter of the transit interdictions and on the matter of any individuals whose placement on the reserve had been conducted in a manner inconsistent with applicable transit agreements. Any individuals. Placement. Applicable transit agreements. I read those phrases, and I thought about a woman named Para Delion who had been 31 years old and on a registered commercial transit route between 2 fringe colony stations. And I thought about designation code 3K21A4 and a quarry value grade of 4, 7 in the long ground. I logged the protest. The operations staff logged it. Admiral Krast was informed. No reply was transmitted. The estate worlds took 11 days, because precision takes time, and because the resolved claim was going to be precise. 17 targets across 6 estate worlds, the administrative facilities, the transit and holding centers, the military command installations, each one addressed according to the operational plan that had been prepared and rehearsed over 11 months of assembly. On the 3rd estate world, the Conclave's council transmitted a second protest. On the 5th, a third. Each was logged. No reply was transmitted. I want to say something about what the estate worlds looked like on the sensor displays, because it is part of the witness record. And because I think the record should be honest about what the fleet encountered and how it responded. The estate worlds were not barren military installations. They were living planets, agricultural terrains, architecture that reflected centuries of development, populated centers that supported both the noble caste's operations and the service populations, whose labor sustained them. The resolved claims targeting plan had been built with full awareness of this. The fleet's instruments could resolve individual structures at operational ranges, and the operations staff used that resolution to ensure that 17 targets were addressed with the specificity the plan required. I watched the sensor confirmations for each target as it was the addressed. I watched the operations staff work with careful deliberateness through each sequence, verifying target identification before each action, documenting each confirmation with the precision that the operational record demanded. The targets were administrative buildings, transit facilities, command installations, the architecture of a program that had moved 3,114 human beings through its machinery over 34 years. I continued reading names throughout those 11 days. I want to be plain about what the reading was doing to me, in the accumulated weight of it. Each name was a point of contact with a specific person who had passed through that machinery. When I read Tessof Arak, 44 years old, year 22, I was reading the record of someone who had been moved through the kind of facility I was watching being addressed on the sensor, display, received, assessed, graded, transferred, placed. The name and the operational image occupied the same moment in my mind, and I think that is exactly what the Commission intended when it designed the Witness Designate Protocol. The accounting needed a human being who was holding both things at once, who was watching the response and holding the names that required it. I want to be honest about what reading the names did over the weeks of transit and operation to the quality of my thinking about what was happening. I had authenticated the manifest as an administrative document, a supply chain record. I had understood, in the cold analytical mode that authentication requires, what it contained and what it represented. But reading the names, one by one, In the evenings in my quarters aboard ECS Declarant, did something to that analytical understanding that I had not anticipated. It made it specific in a way that the aggregate figures, 3,114, 2,891 confirmed, 223 unaccounted, could not. Each name was a person who had been somewhere before year 3 or year 19 or year 26 of the designation program, who had been traveling between stations, or working at a colony registry, or checking in at a medical relay point, and had not arrived where they were going, and whose absence had been absorbed into the ambient noise of the fringe corridors without anyone looking hard enough at the pattern to find it. By day 12, the day before the final processing installation was addressed, I had reached entry 2004 in the alphabetical sequence. A man named Tessoff Arak, 38 years old, taken from a colony registration queue in the transit band in year 22. Designation code 6M55P3, Quarry value grade of 3.9, reflecting, in the conclave's rubric, lower than median physical conditioning but notable environmental adaptation markers, released on the long ground in year 22. I read his name aloud in my quarters and moved to the next entry. Processing installations were the final phase. 11 installations, distributed across 3 star systems adjacent to conclave space. These were the facilities the designation program had used as its operational backbone. The reception points where humans taken from the transit corridors had been brought first, before transfer to the estate worlds, for grading and then to the long ground for placement. The installations were the beginning of the supply chain. The reserve was the end. Everything in between, the transit, the assessment, the grading rubric, the designation codes, the careful record-keeping on Vorak crystalline substrate, had been the machinery connecting the beginning to the end. The Commission had known from the beginning of the planning process that the processing installations needed to be part of the response and had included them in the operational parameters as the final phase to be addressed after the estate world targets. Reasoning was the same reasoning that had placed the reserve first. The accounting needed to be complete. The program had a specific architecture, and that architecture needed to be accounted for completely. From the long ground back to the facilities where it began, 6 days for 11 installations. I was on the command deck for the final 2 days, because I had stopped returning to my quarters in the evenings and had been spending most of each day at the observation station. Krast had seen me there for the 3rd consecutive morning without comment, which I took as her assessment that a witness designate who wanted to watch could watch. On the final day, the morning of day 17, the last of the 11 processing installations was addressed. The operations officer confirmed the completion, and the timestamp was recorded, and the final installation's operational record was closed. Krast said to the operations officer, "Log completion." The operations officer logged it. Then Krast turned to me, a small adjustment of her position at her station. The same economy of motion she brought to everything. She said, "You've clearance for the surface." The shuttle took me down the following morning. I want to describe the surface of Vorak Kos as I experienced it, because the description is part of the witness record, and because I believe physical reality of the place, the actual sensory experience of standing in the terrain where it had happened, belongs in this document alongside the administrative and operational facts. The surface was warm, the local star was strong at the latitude where we landed, and the warmth was dry, the kind of heat that moves across open ground and carries dust. The amber color I had seen from orbit was present at ground level as a quality of the light, quite the same as any light I had seen in my 41 years of service, or in the years since. It was warm and golden, and it fell across managed terrain that I could read, standing in it. The way you can read a garden that has been designed by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The ridgelines were visible from the landing point. They rose to the north and east, shaped crests that created defined sightlines across the broad flats of the reserve's central terrain. The approach corridors were wide. Cleared paths cut through what had been allowed to grow as natural-seeming cover, irregular enough to appear organic, placed with enough precision that I could see, looking at them, with the manifest's terrain maps in mind, the function of each one. The cover vegetation was still in place. The species distributions I had read about in the program's reserve management records, planted to provide specific densities of concealment at specific locations across the ground. The flora was alive and undisturbed. The reserve's management architecture had not been addressed because it was not a military installation or an administrative facility. It was terrain. It was the long ground itself, and it would remain terrain after we left. 3,114 people had been released into this terrain. I stood in it for a long time. I thought about the manifest. I thought about 34 years. I thought about the way the program had been structured. The careful, low-visibility acquisition from thinly monitored transit corridors, the elaborate processing chain, the meticulous record-keeping on crystalline substrate, the reserve's engineered terrain. I thought about the fact that none of this had been hidden from the Vorak Conclave's own people. It had been a cultural institution, the highest expression of hereditary distinction. The practice that organized the social hierarchy of a civilization that had managed, through the elaborate machinery of aristocracy, to make the ritual hunting of other species into something that felt, to the people at the top of it, like a natural right. A thing earned, a thing deserved. I thought about what it meant that they had done this with care and precision and good record, keeping for 34 years, and that the care and precision and good record-keeping was what had ended them. They had believed, I think, that the outer transit corridors were permanent, that the thinness of the monitoring architecture in the fringe zones was a permanent feature of the landscape they operated in, that the gap between their surveillance posture and Earth governance's patrol density in that zone was a structural constant rather than a temporary condition. They had built 34 years of program infrastructure on that belief. They had maintained careful records of everything they did, because they did not expect those records to be read by anyone outside their own administrative apparatus. The Southern Kells crew had been transporting those records to a secondary archive site when the Interdiction Authority stopped them for a different reason entirely. I thought about the watch officer on the Interdiction Authority patrol who had been thorough enough to probe the hull thickness against the vessel's registered specifications. I do not know who that officer is. The classification order sealed the identity of the Southern Kells seizure team along with everything else. But whoever they were, they had been thorough when thoroughness was not required and was not expected, and the thorough probe was why I was standing on the long ground with the warm amber light on my face and the still air carrying dust across the managed terrain. I stood there. I took out the personal display I carried and opened the manifest's alphabetical sequence at the entry I had reached. On the final evening, before we arrived at Vorak Kaz, entry 2047, and I read the name aloud into the warm, still air. His name was Veton Moraz. He had been 44 years old when he was taken from a colony registration in the transit band. He had been assigned designation code 7R88K2 and a quarry value grade of 4.1. He had been placed on the long ground in year 26 of the program. There was no further entry for him after placement. I read his name aloud. I stood with it for a moment. The amber light was on the shaped ridgelines to the north, and the dust moved across the approach corridors, and the cover vegetation was still and quiet in the dry heat. Then I walked back to the shuttle. I have been asked, in the years since, whether I thought the resolved claim was proportionate. I understand the question, and I do not dismiss it, because proportionality has real moral content, and the question of whether a response is proportionate to its provocation is a question that serious people take seriously, and that I have thought about with seriousness in the years since the operation. I have also been asked whether I felt anything resembling regret in the years since, whether the operational record, reviewed at distance, produced any second thoughts about the decision the Commission had made or the decision I had made to be present for it. I will answer that question directly, because it deserves directness. No, not because I am incapable of regret. I have regrets of other kinds, other decisions made over 41 years of service, that I carry with the same care I carry the manifest. Because the thing the Commission decided, and the thing the resolved claim executed, and the thing I witnessed, was not a decision that generates regret when you understand what it was responding to. What it was responding to was 34 years and 3,114 names and an 8-category grading rubric designed to assess the value of human beings as prey. Regret, in that context, would require a form of moral equivalence that I cannot achieve and do not want to achieve. Here is the fullest answer I can give about proportionality. The Vorak Conclave ran the designation program for 34 years. It acquired 3,114 human beings from the fringe transit corridors, adults between 19 and 61, taken from commercial transports, from colony registration queues, from a medical relay station. It graded each of them against an 8-category rubric that assessed their value as Quarry, transported them through a chain of 11 processing installations to the estate worlds for final grading, and then to the long ground, a managed reserve world that the Conclave had spent decades engineering for the purpose of hunting them. 2,891 were confirmed killed in the reserve's own records. 223 were unaccounted for. The manifest's notation, in Vorak administrative shorthand, translated as unresolvable at intake, which means they did not survive the processing chain. It had done this while maintaining regular diplomatic relations with Earth governance, while operating as a recognized entity in the interstellar transit framework, while its commercial vessels traveled the same corridors from which it was acquiring our people, while it filed transit-ban trade claims and sent polished diplomatic communications and expected, when the Syslans from the Commission on Alien Offense began, to be offered appropriate channels. The resolved claim addressed the reserve. It addressed 17 administrative, transit, and military command targets across 6 estate worlds. It addressed 11 processing installations across 3 star systems. It spent 17 days completing this accounting. It transmitted no ultimatum, no diplomatic notification, no advance request for explanation. It logged the Conclave's protests and continued. When I am asked whether that was proportionate, I ask the question back. Proportionate to what measure? The Conclave had a measure. It had assessed 3,114 human beings and assigned each a number describing their value as prey. That was their measure of proportion. A 6-character code, a grade between 1.0 and 6. A placement date, the terrain of the long ground. I have a different measure. It runs to 3,114 entries, each one a name. I finished extracting the full sequence 2 years after the operation. Working through the remaining entries in my study at home in the evenings, the same window over the Corvold Bay, the same chair, 147 entries at a session. The biographical research continued in parallel. The missing person reports, the transit discrepancy filings, the colony registry records. And eventually I had attached some form of identifying information to 2,621 of the 3,114. The remaining 493 were names with nothing more behind them than the Vorak designation code and the intake notation. They had been taken from places that left no recoverable record of them. Even their names I could only infer in some cases. 4 of them are listed in my compilation as name unknown, the intake date and acquisition point coordinates as the only identifying data. The last entry in the alphabetical sequence was a woman named Yeva Threnis. She had been 26 years old. She had been taken from a commercial transport in the outer transit corridor in year 29 of the program. She had been assigned designation code 9V14R7 and a quarry value grade of 3-6. She had been placed on the long ground in year 29. I read her name aloud in my study. On the night I reached the end of the sequence, I sat with it for a moment. I wrote it in the record. Then I closed the file. The record stands.